Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of The Defense of the Faith by Cornelius Van Til. In this video, I will be covering chapter 13 of the book, which is titled Amsterdam and Old Princeton. Sounds like a really boring college football game or something, doesn't it? Transatlantic. I don't know. Actually, Amsterdam and Old Princeton in this context refer to two approaches of apologetics. They differ from each other, but they are both Reformed or Calvinist methods. The Old Princeton method was popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In this book, it is mostly identified with B.B. Warfield, though there were many prominent theologians who contributed to it and promoted it. And the Amsterdam method is mostly identified with Abraham Kuyper. Though he doesn't fully embrace either method, Van Til's thought is more influenced by Kuyper and the Amsterdam method, and he refers to Kuyper far more in this chapter than he does to Warfield. Although, as we will see, he refers to many different theologians in this chapter. The big problem with the Old Princeton method, as Van Til sees it, is that it begins with natural theology and then builds up to Christianity. Van Til, as we have seen, insists that you must start with Christianity because without the truth of Christianity, nothing else makes sense. Here's the thing, though. Even if you think that epistemologically Christianity must be the basis for everything else, which it can't be, since even if you wanted to say that you had to presuppose the truth of Christianity before anything else, there's a bunch of other stuff you have to presuppose before you can presuppose the truth of Christianity, whether you fucking like it or not. But never mind all that for now. Even if you think Christianity must be the basis for all truth, must be the basis for comprehending everything else, doesn't it make more sense, in terms of approach, to open with something broader and less partisan and doctrinal, like natural theology, to start with areas where there might be some points of agreement with a non-believer, if you're trying to reach out to someone who is not of your faith, and then you start to build your persuasive case from there, from those points that you can identify that you and the other person have in common. Your persuasive case, not your ultimate fully formed theology, but the case that you're trying to make to the other person for why they ought to adopt your theology as their own. If I were trying to persuade a non-Christian, particularly someone who was dismissive or maybe even a little hostile toward my religion, that they ought to convert to my religion, I don't see how my worldview has to be the objectively correct one in order for anything to make sense. And oh, by the way, you already know I'm right. You're just suppressing your knowledge of the truth because of what a perverted sinner you are, is the best opening line. I'm not saying that the natural theology approach would work on someone like me, but then again, an avowed atheist who has heard all the arguments before and can articulate why they think those arguments are horseshit isn't the preferred target for an apologist anyway. Apologetics, I am convinced, after having reviewed so many of these books over the last few years, is mostly meant to reassure people who are already of the faith. And to the extent that it does concern itself with converting outsiders, it aims not for the informed non-believers, but for the rubes who haven't given the subject much thought. And I know that rubes might seem like a harsh characterization of people liable to be swayed by apologetics, but I don't mean to demean those people so much as I mean to put the apologist and what he does in the proper context. Because whether an apologist intends to be deceptive and misleading or not, and I actually think most of them are true believers, not willful con artists, what they are doing is innately deceptive and misleading. They are presenting people with supposedly unanswerable questions which have been answered without recourse to their faith. They are misrepresenting science and misrepresenting the history of not only the world in general, but in many cases of their own church. The apologist may not see it as deceitful. He may have a different opinion than someone like me on those matters, but it's certainly not honest. What the apologist does is certainly not honest. If you have a somewhat objective understanding of the facts that are relevant to the case that the apologist makes. If it were honest, and if it really had a compelling case to be made based on facts and sound logic, it would appeal to people whether they were informed on the subject or not. As it stands, it's a three-card Monte game. And the only people who put down money to play three-card Monte are those who haven't figured out that it's a con. Anyway, I digress. Van Til compares and contrasts the thinking of Warfield and Kuyper. Theologically, they agree on much, but they differ in terms of their methodology when it comes to apologetics. Warfield argues for approaching the non-Christian or the natural man, the unregenerated man, as opposed to the regenerated man or the saved person, the Calvinist, on neutral territory. For beginning with natural theology, as previously mentioned, and then working up to Christianity. First, you persuade the non-believer that theism is more likely to be true than non-theism. Then you persuade the non-believer that Christianity is the most plausible form of theism. It's a simple three-step process. First, you get the theism, then you get the Christianity, then you get the women. Clearly, Van Til departs from Warfield on that point. He agrees with Kuyper that there can be no common ground between the respective worldviews of a non-believer and a Christian. More than that, there can be no neutral ground on which to meet the non-believer as a Christian, because neutrality on the question of the truth of Christianity is impossible. Everyone is either for or against the one true God of the Bible. Van Til and the army of presuppositionalist drones his work spawned differ from more traditional apologists in many ways, but this is one respect in which they agree 100%. Like all other Christian apologists, Van Til and his fellow presuppositionalists consider the, to me, mundane and irrelevant question of whether or not his religion is true to be the most important question there is. How many times have you heard an evangelist or an apologist say, the question of whether or not Jesus was the Son of God is the most important question you will ever consider in your life? They almost all do that in some way. And when I say that it's a mundane and irrelevant question, I do so because I don't think there's any significant possibility that it is actually true. Of course it would be relevant and anything but mundane if I thought there was a realistic chance that it was true and that my eternal soul, if that existed, did in fact hang in the balance and depend on what my answer to that question was. But if James Earl Jones had thought that Kevin Costner really had a gun in his pocket in Field of Dreams, he probably would have taken him much more seriously. But it was obviously his finger. I mean, come on. But even though Van Til sides mostly with Kuyper, he disagrees with Kuyper on one key point. Kuyper considered it useless to attempt to reason with non-believers. Van Til agrees with Kuyper that Christianity is the antithesis of non-belief and that non-Christians are without what he calls living, loving, true knowledge of God, but non-Christians do have the sense of deity that all people share. Quote, hence, Warfield was quite right in maintaining that Christianity is objectively defensible, and the natural man has the ability to understand intellectually, though not spiritually, the challenge presented to him. And no challenge is presented to him unless it is shown him that on his principle he would destroy all truth and meaning. Then, if the Holy Spirit enlightens him spiritually, he will be born again unto knowledge and adopt with love the principle he previously was anxious to destroy. And this is essentially the Kuyper-Warfield synthesis, which I mentioned way back in the first video of this series. It's the major contribution to apologetics for which Van Til is known to this day. The combination of Kuyper's theology and Warfield's emphasis on the importance of apologetics and Warfield's concept that you could defend Christianity to non-believers rationally. It's the unkillable Frankenstein monster of Christianity. No matter how many bullets skeptics pump into it. It just keeps shuffling forward, occasionally grabbing hold of someone too slow to get out of its way and choking them to death. This is presuppositional apologetics. This is what was spawned by the unholy union of Kuyper and Warfield. And even though it doesn't really do anything to slow it down, we keep on shooting at it. We skeptics, we atheists. Whenever we see it shambling towards us, we all take aim and fire, and we think that maybe this time, if we all just concentrate our efforts, we'll be able to take the monster down for good. But it never works. And we know going in that it's not going to work, but we go for it anyway because A, it's a horrible monster that deserves to be attacked, and B, it's just fun. It just feels good to shoot the fucking thing full of holes. I've wandered from the path yet again. Forgive me. Back to the text. Van Til delves into the supernatural, what it is, how we know it exists, etc. This is an important part of apologetics. If you're going to try and convince someone that a supernatural God exists, you better have a good way of convincing them that the supernatural is a thing that is there. Well, Van Til does have a way of doing it, but like his other ways of doing things, it's just not a very good way of doing it. He introduces us to his thought on the supernatural by referencing William Brenton Green Jr., who was a teacher of apologetics at Princeton, who Van Til describes as his revered teacher. Drawing on a series of articles on Christian metaphysics written by Green in the late 1890s, Van Til writes about the reality, the manifestation, and the personality of the supernatural. So first, the reality of the supernatural. Why should we believe the supernatural is real? Because, according to Van Til and Green, who he cites, most schools of philosophy support it. Even non-Christian philosophies include a concept of the supernatural that, while not precisely Christian, point toward the Christian concept. And were it not for our human limitations, it would be easy to illustrate the truth of this claim. Now, I say human limitations. I think that's what he meant. Van Til quotes Green as saying, "Did not our limits forbid, nothing could be easier than to establish that philosophy in general declares the reality of the supernatural and in such a way that suggests the Christian version of the supernatural." That could refer to our limits as finite beings, based on other things Van Til has said in the text up to now. I sort of interpreted it that way. But it could also refer to the limits imposed on Green as the writer of the articles, which Van Til is citing, as in he just didn't have enough room to go into it exhaustively in the article he was writing. Either way, considering that this is not an article, but a book that Van Til clearly had lots of space to play with, it's a laughable cop-out. I could easily prove this to you, but I just can't do it right now. Maybe Green didn't have enough space. I understand there are limitations placed, and articles in magazines and newspapers cannot be of unlimited length, but Cornelius Van Til was writing about this and quoting it in this book. Do you really think he didn't have enough room to go into it a little bit more? Also, religion needs the idea of the supernatural, obviously. And there's one more thing. Quote, "And lastly, the supernatural is a necessity of thought. Thought requires the idea of causation. Thought requires that when we think of acts, we also think of an agent. Every thought of the finite presupposes the supernatural." How does that work? Seriously, he doesn't explain that or expand on it at all. He just declares that thought requires the supernatural, as though it's self-evident, as though he expects we'll just read that and go, well, yeah, clearly. Why does thought presuppose the supernatural? Why is the supernatural necessary for an understanding of causation? You won't find any more about it in here. Anyway, what about the manifestation of the supernatural? So much for the reality of the supernatural. What about the manifestation? Well, obviously the supernatural can manifest itself, because how else would we know about it? That takes care of that then. That is almost exactly what he says. That is all he says about it. I wonder why he even bothered to make this a separate category in his considerations of the supernatural. If all he was going to say was essentially, Does the supernatural manifest itself? Sure it does. You've heard of it, haven't you? Do the mysterious forces of the Bermuda Triangle manifest themselves? Sure they do. You've heard of the Bermuda Triangle, haven't you? And anyway, something made David Copperfield disappear. Now, as for the personality of the supernatural, Van Til cites Green as saying that the supernatural must be personal. This is because the supernatural must have something to do with the first cause, and the first cause must have been personal for some reason. Judging from these references, Green was even worse at this shit than Van Til. So I suppose I should congratulate Van Til because the pupil has clearly exceeded the teacher. The mediocre pupil has exceeded the even more mediocre teacher. It's just one bold declaration after another with nothing whatsoever to back it up or even explain why we should regard it as remotely plausible, let alone the self-evident truth that Green and Van Til apparently think it is. Why must the supernatural exist? Assuming it exists, why must it be personal? Why must it be connected to the first cause? Why must the first cause have been personal? You need to explain this shit, especially if, as you claim, you're writing this book to prospective apologists. You're trying to train them up in the ways of defending the faith. The fucking book is called The Defense of the Faith. You're just going to put these words in people's mouths without giving them any understanding of the ideas behind them, so they'll just spew out nonsense that even they don't understand, as though we're all supposed to just accept it and go, oh wow, that's totally right. I can see that. That makes complete sense. I hope we don't have any questions for them. I hope for their sake. We don't have any follow-up. We don't ask for more information. We don't ask one of the people parroting Van Til in the modern age to say, oh, that's an interesting thought. Can you explain to me why, to your way of thinking, the supernatural is a necessity for the existence of reality or for the concept of causation? Because there's nothing in here about it at all. It's not even mentioned. There's not even a citation that says, if you want to know more about why the supernatural is considered necessary for the existence of reality and why we come to the conclusion that finite thought presupposes the supernatural. If you want to have more information about that, go read this book or go read this article. There's nothing in this. And this fucking thing is cited to death. There are citations in this from Van Til himself in his original text and from the editor of this edition. It is cited to death. Nothing about where we should go to find more information on these ideas. They're just dropped in your lap like a dead fish. Here you go. Finite thought presupposes supernatural. There you go. Anyway, after spending several pages lovingly detailing Green's concept of the supernatural, Van Til summarizes Green by saying that he begins with the abstract possibility of the supernatural and then moves forward until he finally gets to the Gospels. Sound familiar? Yeah. Quote, "It is this avowed insistence that apologetics must deal neutrally with such questions as the existence of God and the facts of Christianity that marks the old Princeton apologetics. And it is this type of apologetics that is definitely rejected as being out of accord with the principles of the Reformed faith." Pretty sure you already made that point, Corny. Repeatedly. Was he being paid by the letter or something when he wrote this fucking doorstop? He must have been, right? He must have been paid by the letter. How else would you account for this many pages when really the material that he doesn't repeat himself in is about that much of it? Next, Van Til shares with us another example of the old Princeton method, because we haven't got it yet, through the work of Floyd E. Hamilton. The old Princeton method. Traditional apologetics, whatever you want to call it, doesn't work for Van Til because it doesn't start out by totally dismissing the worldview of the non-Christian. Got it. Sweet fucking Christ. Only the granddaddy of presuppositional apologetics could actually get me to side with other apologists. Compared to this guy and his absolutist, arrogant, I can't possibly be wrong because then nothing else would make any sense bullshit, William Lane Craig, who is a preposterous goddamn buffoon of a human being, looks reasonable. It pains me to say that. but it's true. Finally, Van Til comes to Kuyper, the guy that he mostly agrees with, but he doesn't agree with him on everything. Van Til focuses his examination of Kuyper on Kuyper's concept of formal faith. And by formal faith, he means the sort of faith that we all have, the faith that we have in the reliability of our senses or in the truth of the logical axioms on which our reasoning is built. That kind of faith, the kind of faith that is not religious faith, but confidence in the truth of certain things that allows us to function in the world, allows us to do science, allows us to eat and sleep and do all the things we need to do. Kuyper calls that formal faith. But Kuyper also argues that all people are born with a faith in God, and that it is this faith that is suppressed by sin, and it is that suppression of the faith in God that is removed by Christ when someone is saved. The problem for Van Til is that Kuyper also says, or at least Kuyper's work implies, it's unclear from Van Til's description, that the misinterpretation of the world caused by sin can, in principle, be overcome without the work of Christ by relying on this formal faith. Quote, "If Kuyper is to have an internally consistent picture of the Christian view of things that he has so valiantly set forth, he must dispose of the idea of faith as purely formal. Whenever he maintains the formal idea of faith, he virtually grants that the man who works on the assumption of human autonomy has the right principle with which to interpret not only the external phenomena, but even the causes of things." See, with Van Til, it's very important that an apologist not grant that a non-Christian have anything right. Kuyper is saying, well, we all have formal faith. We all have faith in logical axioms. We all have faith in our senses. We all have the ability to draw conclusions that are reliable. We have sound reasoning for the way we operate in the world, and that's what he calls formal faith. But Van Til says, no, 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 no. If you say that, then you're saying that people have autonomy, and if people have autonomy, then in principle they can figure things out without God, and if they can figure things out without God, then what are we doing here? You have to be completely reliant on God. Everything has to be built on the foundation of his God, or he has nothing. So even his great teacher Kuyper, who to me, other than the Christian stuff, which I granted, that's kind of ridiculous to say, oh, this theologian was right, except for all the Christian stuff. But when he's talking about what he calls formal faith, I'm completely with him on that. I think I've made that distinction myself many times. Even when some of my fellow atheists would bridle at the term faith, I would say, well, let's think about the sense in which the term faith is used. If you're talking about what Kuyper would call formal faith, I have no problem with saying I have faith in things in that sense. I just think we need to distinguish it from religious faith. And when religious people try to equivocate and use the term faith in both senses and try to say, well, you have faith in the law of gravity, so why can't I have faith in Jesus Christ? We have to point out that he's talking about two different things. But the term faith, in a certain sense, is completely fine. So I'm not against Kuyper there. But Van Til says, oh, no, 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 you can't have formal faith, because formal faith means you can get things right on your own. Anyway, there is one other quote from Van Til in this section that I want to share before I move on and then wrap up this chapter, because it's relevant to something that we have discussed repeatedly throughout this series. Quote, "Kuyper himself has insisted that even in the observation of facts, the subjective element enters into the picture. There is not the least harm in this. It is a purely metaphysical and psychological fact. He acknowledges that all of our observations are unavoidably subjective. A metaphysical and psychological fact, he calls it. So how then does his worldview, which has as a basic tenet that we can have certain knowledge of things if God chooses to reveal it to us, make any sense at all? He has just acknowledged the fact that undermines his entire epistemology, not to mention a large portion of Calvinist theology. If, as we both agree, our observations are subjective, how can we ever be certain that what we think is the revelation of God is in fact the revelation of God? How can we be certain that the Holy Spirit has really, truly regenerated our consciousness and we haven't just misunderstood something or hallucinated something or gotten the wrong impression or imagined that the Holy Spirit has regenerated our consciousness when in fact no such thing has happened? When it gets right down to it, how can we be 100% certain that anything in our lives, including the religions and God concepts we encounter, is not a hallucination generated by our brains? Now, I'm not saying that that's a realistic possibility or that I believe that we are brains in vats or that I'm just a brain in a vat and all of this is a hallucination. Of course, I don't believe that. But if that possibility exists, however remotely, thanks to the limitations acknowledged by Van Til in that quote I read, thanks to the fact that our perception is unavoidably subjective, then in what way can Van Til say that his worldview, his epistemology, is any different, any better, any more superior, any more capable of furnishing us with 100% certainty and true knowledge than anyone else's? He is in the same room that the rest of us are in, and he can draw the door on the wall with chalk as often as he likes and say, there, see, I've drawn you a door. None of these other guys have drawn you a door, but there's the door. Doesn't mean you can go through the fucking door. The door is not real. There is no door. Van Til affirms this in his words, metaphysical and psychological fact that all human experience is subjective and therefore incapable of furnishing us with 100% certainty. Yet he still spends 400 pages of this book, not to mention the many other books he wrote, smugly crowing about how his worldview alone is logically consistent and able to justify knowledge. And I know if I pressed Van Til, he might retreat to the same argument that many modern presuppositionalists favor, that God has revealed things to them in such a way that they can be certain. But again, that's just drawing the door. I will throw that claim on the pile, on the mountainous heap of unsubstantiated claims, along with most of the rest of what Van Til has written in this book. It means nothing. If you can't show me how it could be true, then I have no reason to accept that it is true. Van Til goes on to review the work of Bavinck before wrapping up the chapter, but the broad points that he makes in that consideration are just more of the same that we've already discussed ad nauseum, and the details are the sort of things that only theology nerds could possibly give a shit about, so I'm going to skip it. Van Til ends the chapter by reiterating that theology and apologetics must operate according to the same principles in order to be consistent, that appeals to neutral ground or common notions are unacceptable, that the Bible must be placed as the ultimate source of knowledge, not man, that only the reformed method of apologetics can show the difference between Christian and non-Christian thought, and that once that difference has been shown to a sinner, only the work of the Holy Spirit can lift the scales from their eyes, as it were, and allow them to truly know God. Quote, standing on the shoulders of Warfield and Kuyper, we honor them best if we build on the main thrust of their thought, rather than if we insist on carrying on what is inconsistent with their basic position. Then we are most faithful to Calvin and to St. Paul. I have no particular respect for either person, but isn't it interesting that Van Til places Calvin before Paul? I know that he's a Calvinist, but still, shouldn't Paul be a bigger deal? I mean, his shit is actually in the Bible, the thing that Van Til claims to be the unquestionable source of all knowledge. Then again, the fact that Paul is such a big deal to Christians is a very good argument against taking the Bible seriously as a source of absolute infallible truth. Jesus was supposedly the Son of God, so assuming you believe that, I can understand listening to what he had to say, or at least what people wrote down saying that he said, assuming that you believe all of those things are true. But Paul, by his own admission, according to his own writing, judging him purely by what we see just in the Bible, he was just some guy who claimed he had a vision of Jesus. By his own account, he never met Jesus, and we only have his account. He's the only person who said, yeah, I was walking to Damascus one day, and I had this vision of Jesus, and he told me all these things. That's just Paul saying that. Isn't that amazing? We have just this guy's word on the fact that he had a vision of Jesus, and suddenly everyone is taking his opinion on Jesus-related stuff seriously. So seriously that his shit made it into the Bible. And now it's considered infallible truth. Paul got his shit into the Bible. The same way movie studios get their movies nominated for Oscars. He was popular with the right people. He got around, he shook hands, he told stories, he gave opinions, he wrote letters, and when the time came to collect all this stuff, people in the church said, oh, hey, if we're canonizing shit, we've got to have Paul in there. I mean, we all love Paul. And they loved him so much that they even included a few of the ones like 1st and 2nd Timothy that he didn't even actually write. Anyway, I know you came for the critique of Van Til. Well, the bitching about the nonsensical reverence shown to Paul is free, my friends. That's it for this video. That's it for this chapter. That's almost it for this series. In the next video, I will wrap up the Defense of the Faith series. There's one more chapter to cover. It is chapter 14, Common Grace and Existentialism. And with that, I will conclude this series on Cornelius Van Til's The Defense of the Faith. Thank you guys so much for watching and for hanging in there with me to this point. I'm glad that this has been of some use and some interest to you. Please, as always, comment. Let me know what you think about this. Tell me I'm right. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me where I could have done better. Tell me where I made a really good point, because that's always nice to hear. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I will see you to finish this off in the next video.